I will use English only partially. Meine Damen und Herren, liebe Besucher aus nah und fern, ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Tag. Zunächst möchte ich den Organisatoren, namentlich Dr. Wolfgang Quattenberg, für die Einladung zu dieser Feier und für die Möglichkeit, zu diesem besonderen Anlass zu sprechen, meinen aufrichtigen Dank aussprechen. Es ist eine große Ehre und Verpflichtung für mich. Als ich im Sommer 1968 als 12-jähriger Junge zum ersten Mal mit meinen Eltern diesen gewürdigen Ort besuchte, ahnte ich noch nicht, dass ich viele Jahre später als Referent hierher zurückkehren würde. Mein Name ist Vit Bárta, ich bin Tscheche und der Sohn von Drahomir Bárta, einem ehemaligen Häftling der deutschen Konzentrationslagern, zunächst in Theresienstadt, später in Mauthausen, Rädelzipf und schließlich hier in Ebensee. Mein Vater verbrachte die schwersten Jahre seines Lebens hier in Ebensee. Und now I would like to switch to English, if you allow me. In my relatively long speech, I would like to first expose his personal story as I perceived it as a child of the post-war generation. Then I will try to place this story in a broader historical framework and finally draw lessons for today. I would like to take up a literary turn of phrase that my father used in the preface to the Czech edition of the book by the Russian Ilya Nazarov, his former cellmate, published in 1963 under the title "We Will Never Forget." The poetic phrase is throwing a message in a bottle into the sea of time. Witnesses of horrific historical events usually try to pass on the message. They hope that despite possible adversity and obstacles, they will place their testimony in the hands of future generations who will be reached by a profound and intelligible experience accompanied by the utmost urgency. They believe that horrors they have experienced will be so chilling when passed on that they will be hopefully not repeated. But no one can be sure in advance whether these messages will ever find their intended audience, whether they will be intelligible to future readers, or whether they will be properly understood. When my father arrived in Ebensee with the first transport of prisoners in November 1943, he was barely 23 years old. Thanks to his high school education and his good knowledge of foreign languages, he managed to get a job as a camp clerk, Lagerschreiber. This gave him a good overview of what was going on in the camp and enabled him to become involved in the slowly forming resistance movement of the prisoners, which was conducted under the strictest secrecy. He did this as a young and enthusiastic communist who was driven by the ideals of solidarity and international cooperation, sought out like-minded prisoners from other countries. He knew which new people were gradually arriving in the camp with the transport and together with his closest fellow prisoners, he tried to win them over to the common cause. At first, it was only a partial relief of the extremely difficult conditions in the camp, at best the saving of individual lives if that was possible at all, thanks to small evasive maneuvers and evasions against the orders of Nazis. The closer the end of war was approached, however, the more underground movement of prisoners became oriented toward finding ways to prevent the mass bloodshed and unbridled violence that could realistically be expected in moments of escalation. What at first might have seemed to be pure fiction turned out in the end to be a very useful, beneficial, and life-saving idea. I don't want to go into detail about what happened in the Ebensee camp until the liberation by the American Army. Thanks to the long-standing and systematic efforts of the Museum of Contemporary History, to whom we are very grateful for preserving our historical memory, this has been comprehensively documented. I would like rather to address how the imprisonment affected the later life of my father and both my parents. I should point out that my mother was imprisoned at Auschwitz and that she and my father knew each other well by then. However, her memories of that extremely depressing place in Poland were so hurtful and depressing that she hid them from the family for most of her life and never spoke with us about them. She did not return to them until she was very old. Then she recorded the horrible experience on tape. Even then, she wanted to be alone with her memories, so she did it without our presence. My father, on the other hand, carried the memories of his imprisonment with him throughout his life, often telling us about them and returning to them on various occasions. His friends, among the former fellow prisoners, mostly French, Russians, Yugoslavs, and Germans, formed a separate and special chapter in his life. With many of them, he maintained lifelong contacts. He wrote them long letters, followed their life stories with interest, and visited them whenever possible. What I remember most are times when my father met with friends close to him on occasions like today, often unexpectedly and unplanned. More than once, I have seen men of advanced age, dazzled by a lifetime of experience, fall into each other's arm after not having seen each other for many years, unable for a long time to speak a coherent word, and the tears of emotion that rolled inexorably down their cheeks were eloquent testimony to the deep emotions of their minds. In a well-known movie, it is recommended that if you want to make sure that the bonds of friendship and love between people are still strong, you should go to the airport where people who are close to each other are greeted after a long period of separation. I can only add that I have never experienced such a moving and touching encounter as that of my father with his former concentration camp prisoners. The friendship, made under the inhuman conditions of the time, lasted a lifetime and were the most precious one could have of dream of. They were forged from stainless steel of the highest quality. To be more specific, during my life, I have met names like Jean Lafitte, Henri Koch, Hrvoje Macanovič, Toma Petrovič, Lubomír Zečevič, Miloš Bajič, Ernst Lercher, Kuno Wegner, and Nikolai Bayev. I met some of them personally, and pictures of Miloš Bajič and Nikolai Bayev still adorn my apartment. If there is anyone among you who knew these men personally, or at least heard of them, I feel vicariously connected to you in this way. My father was writing a secret diary during his imprisonment. As far as I know, it was the only comprehensive document of its kind produced in the concentration camps on Austrian territory. Its existence was known to one or at most two people who helped my father hide it in a reasonably safe place. The small penciled notes found their place behind the fire extinguisher. I have no doubt that in a camp where total depravity reigned and where a person could be killed even in an instant, any diary entry that was discovered could have cost my father his life. This diary also took on a life of its own after the end of the war. Probably the most important role was played in the fall of 1972, when trial of Anton Gans took place in Memmingen in Germany. My father took part in the trial at that time as one of the witnesses, and his diary served as important evidence from which he was quoted at length during the trial. One could say that the bottle containing the diary's message did eventually end up in the right hands. But this happened much later than any legal seeker would have wished, especially since Anton Gans died on cancer less than a year later. When my parents returned from Memmingen, as a young man of 16, I had the uplifting feeling that my father's diary had played a role that went far beyond the boundaries of our family and perhaps even beyond those of all of the Czechoslovakia at that time. However, it was more than 3 decades before the diary was published in its complete form. This was done in German and with the significant cooperation of the historian Florian Freund, who had already quoted extensively from my father's diary in the 1980s in his detailed and extraordinarily meticulous scholarly studies of the concentration camps in Austria. Unfortunately, Florian Freund cannot be with us today, so I would like to send him a long-distance greeting to Vienna. My lasting debt to my father is the publication of his diary in the Czech language in which it was written. He himself never got around to it in his very active life. And when at the end of his life he began to work on the publication of the diary, unfortunately his long illnesses prevented him from doing so. His plan was to accompany the diary entries with drawings by Miloš Bajić, whom he had sincerely loved all his life. When I think about the broader context of the Nazi concentration camps and political developments in Europe after the war, there is one thing I still cannot understand. The people who rebelled against the unbridled oppression in the camp here in Ebensee at that time were undoubtedly courageous and honorable. Of course, they could only mind their own business and try to survive as best they could. But they choose a more difficult and often dangerous path, one of human solidarity and mutual help. In my father's rich archive, I found many interesting observations and notes after his death in 1998. One of them seems to me particularly eloquent and apt. He says that many people in the course of their lives developed habits of selflessness for the common cause or for others. But once they found themselves in the camp, in a life of selfish exploitation, they suddenly became completely defenseless. Suddenly, they lacked the shell they had spent their entire lives scraping off with good intentions. Fools that they were. For me, the irony of fate remains that these people who displayed humanity, personal courage, and enthusiasm often fought against Nazi totalitarianism under the communist banner, but did not realize that they were helping to bring into the world another totalitarianism that was just as ruthless, as intolerant, just as bloody, and had spread like a cancer throughout Eastern Europe. While the enemy, in the form of fascist Germany, was perfectly clear, easy to grasp, and accurately described during the war, the communist threat at the end of the war was less obvious, operating in a deceptive disguise and often in great detours. Many of the people who so devotedly defended communism at the beginning thus had a long and undoubtedly painful road ahead of them to understand their historical error. For my father, the awakening from communistic illusions began sometimes in 1950s. Certainly, an accident he told me about many years later contributed to this. The scene was Sochi, where our family spent the summer of 1966. There my father met a close Russian cellmate, whose name I unfortunately don't remember. He took both my parents on a boat ride, and only when they were far enough from shore, and he was sure no one else could hear him, did he begin to tell them about all the political atrocities that were the order of the day in the Soviet Union at that time, and that the communist regime of the time wanted to keep secret from the world. My parents were shocked by his heartbreaking account, because they did not recognize the world for which they had ended up in concentration camps and for which they had fought so passionately in their youth. I am convinced that the message our fathers put in the bottle speak of the need to put values such as human freedom and truth to the test, even when their lives are threatened. They were willing to do this for us, and it is now up to us whether we are willing to do the same for our descendants. Russia's unjustified aggression against Ukraine has brought this question completely before us, completely unexpectedly, but with all the urgency of the history. The guilt of the attacking power is undeniable, and it is impossible to escape it. I try to imagine what my father's Russian cellmate would say about today's war in Ukraine if he were still alive, and how far we would have to go in the boat from the coast if he took me this time. I cannot put into words the sadness I feel when I see innocent people dying needlessly every day, and how insignificant life on both sides of the fighting is in the eyes of those whose sanity has been clouded by boundless pride and imperial hubris. This pain is all the more agonizing at the sight of a former concentration camp where the line between life and death was once as thin as the pencil lines of my father's diary, written in fear and terror, but also in the hope that one day he would see better days. Dear listeners, I open before you an imaginary bottle and place my message inside, that no one should fall prey to the insidious illusion that the unbridled violence perpetrated against others cannot affect him or her sooner or later. I throw this bottle into the sea of time in the hope that it will not break on the cliffs of fear, indifference, conciliatory forgetfulness, or defeatism, and that it will arrive where it belongs. This is what the message brought us by our fathers oblige us to do from these very places in the middle of the beautiful mountains that my father admired all his life. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a nice day.